Hello friends and welcome back to Generation Pixel, and if it's the first time you've popped along to the channel, well, you're in for an absolute treat because it's Thursday, and Thursday can mean only one thing. That's correct, it's the A to ZX of the spectrum. So are you ready for some more 8-bit delights? Well, I know I'm ready for it. And we're up to, well, week 7, so it's a letter G today. So hold on tight because the gameplay is going to be right after these titles. So to start with, I thought I'd talk about one of the most important games in video game history, and that is Gobbleman by Arctic Computing. Well, okay, not Gobbleman, but Pac-Man, because back in the day, everyone and their dog wanted to make a Pac-Man clone. And what was awesome about Gobbleman? Well, besides the name of course, which is fantastically funny, the game itself was head and shoulders above the Atari 2600 officially licensed game that was put out for Pac-Man. What they managed to do with this little game was nothing more than spectacular. It was so smooth. Now don't get me wrong, there were bits missing from the game when you compare it to the original Pac-Man. The sound design wasn't great. There was no side tunnels to move from one edge of the screen to the other, and they had to employ a few tricks such as when Pac-Man dies, if you take a close look you can see he just sort of explodes into a bunch of random symbols. But on the whole, if I was faced with playing Gobbleman or playing a Pac-Man on the Atari 2600, well, hands down Gobbleman was going to win every day of the week. It was smoother, more colourful, and much more interesting to play by a country mile. And it's also a fine example of the early video game landscape, where what were essentially bedroom coders simply stealing the idea from a large, well-funded arcade game and squeezing out every last piece of possibility to get some sort of port on an 8-bit microcomputer that would not only just look the part, but play the part, and very often exceed the expectations of what was officially licensed. So if Pac-Man clones are your jam, well, Gobbleman is a must play. And amongst the multitude of other Pac-Man clones that were out there at the time, this one certainly stood head and shoulders above most of them. Sticking with arcade ports, let's move on to an officially licensed one, that's Atari's 1985's Gauntlet port. Now Gauntlet was a game that I absolutely adored back in the arcades, and when we finally got, well, a home port on the ZX Spectrum, we were absolutely ecstatic. Now of course, one of the unique selling points of Gauntlet was that it was a multiplayer game, and to be fair, it should always be played in multiplayer, and the ZX Spectrum, well, it was maybe not powerful enough to have 4 players on at the same time, but it did give you the option of 2 players. And graphically, well, it might not quite stand up to the arcade version, but to be frankly honest, to have it at home, this version was nothing short of spectacular. Now of course, the main gameplay gimmick of Gauntlet was the fact that you were surrounded by hordes upon hordes of mobs, all draining your energy until you eventually died. Now the ZX Spectrum had no right to be able to put hordes and hordes of mobs out there, but they did. They managed to do it, and to this day I don't fully understand, and to be frankly honest, I don't care how they done it, because to get this wonderful piece of art on a ZX Spectrum, well, they get nothing but a hearty round of applause from me. And me and a select few of my friends back in the day, well, we played this game to death, and it was far cheaper than throwing tons of coins at the arcade version, let me tell you that for a fact. And we got at least an equal amount of fun out of doing so. So the Gauntlet port on the ZX Spectrum, yes, it's one of the finest out there, and a must play for anyone who's at all interested in playing games from the ZX Spectrum era. The third game today is, yes, another arcade port, and another really good arcade port, and it's a 1986 port of Ghosts and Goblins from Elite. Now Ghosts and Goblins is fortunately one of those games that has managed to truly stand the test of time. So even if you have no background or knowledge of the ZX Spectrum, you're more than likely to know what Ghosts and Goblins is. And what it is, well, it's a precursor to Dark Souls. Because if we're talking about games where you need to get good, well, Ghosts and Goblins was probably one of the first in that vein. And not only that, if you take a close look, it shares very similar aesthetics. You're a medieval knight and you're fighting monsters. The bad guys are massively powerful and it only takes a couple of hits to kill you. And of course, how do you win the game? Well, you quite simply get good. You play it over and over again, you learn the enemy patterns and try to progress that one stage further every time you play. Now of course, compared to the arcade versions, the ZX Spectrum does have a few weaknesses. As the title of the microcomputer suggests, the Spectrum, it was one of the most early colour capable microcomputers, but however there were limitations. Only so many colours could be shown on screen at one time, and also it had big issues when it came to layering colours. So as you see your wonderful knight there running about trying to kill the zombies and evil crows and killer plants, your main sprite's character, he will change colour depending on the background he's running beside, which was a neat little trick, although could sometimes make it quite difficult to see exactly where you were. All in all, however, it was a solid port. It captured not only the essence of the game, but also the difficulty of the game. And it may not be the hardest version out there, but it's certainly up there with the best, and it's another must play game if you're interested in the ZX Spectrum era. Now, from a game that inspired Dark Souls to a game that inspired Red Dead Redemption. No, I'm only joking, because, well, this is a tongue-in-cheek game. Gunfight, the 1985 game from Ultimate Play the Game, well, it was one of those delightful isometric Spectrum games. Now, if you've seen any of the previous episodes, you'll know what the isometric game was. It was the Spectrum's attempt to put out a 3D style game, and in Gunfight, well, you play as the sheriff, and you have to make your way around the small western town to catch whoever's on the wanted list. The only problem is every character sprite out there will kill you with one touch death on anything that's moving on the screen. So what you have to do is avoid the many mobs that are either walking about or standing jumping in your way while you explore this pseudo 3D town and try and track down the wanted criminal. Now this is a game that I truly wanted to love, and to be frankly honest, I probably did love it back in the day. Playing it these days, however, I found it extremely frustrating. Although it did have some moments of joy, such as when you find the pantomime horse that you get to run about in, which makes you slightly invulnerable for a short period of time. When you do, however, eventually find the person on the wanted list, well, it's a showdown. You have to go for your guns and you have to move that target and shoot as quickly as you can. You have to also bear in mind that you have a revolver with 6 bullets. Now you do have more than 6 bullets, but you can only shoot 6 before you have to reload, which was an interesting mechanic back in the day. But if you didn't pay attention to your bullet count at any given particular time, well, it could spell disaster. And Gunfight wasn't the finest of the isometric games, but you know what, it was certainly fun for the time. And perhaps it actually did, in some small way, inspire someone to go on and make Red Dead Redemption. Who knows, play it for yourself and make that decision on your own. Last up, I'm going to talk about 2 things that I absolutely hate that managed to produce something that I absolutely adored. What I tend to hate is licensed games, and secondly, Activision. But back in 1984, Action Vision, well, they were a game developer with, well, let's just say integrity, because that's how they all start before, you know, they make too much money, become too greedy, and forget the roots that made them the game developers that they once were. But back in 1984, they hadn't quite walked down that path yet, and with a license like Ghostbusters, well, they were certainly onto a winner. Now don't get me wrong, it wasn't a game that everybody loved, and there were different versions or slightly different versions on different microcomputers and home consoles at the time. For me, however, this was the ZX Spectrum, and the ZX Spectrum game, it fulfilled everything that I wanted from a Ghostbusters game back then. Now it was nothing complicated, there was nothing too deep about it. All you had to do was spend your budget and put in your car together, pick the car that you wanted to use, and pick the tools and equipment that you required to, well, catch ghosts. But once you'd done all that boring business stuff, which quite frankly I found interesting at the time and still do to this day, you hit the mean streets of New York and you start hunting ghosts. And to hunt the ghosts, well, you simply drive about the grid-like map of New York, where you will hope that a building has called in ghostly activity and flash for you to indicate they need a ghost busting, or one of the buildings that you pass, if you were wise enough to, well, pick up a PK indicator, highlight itself as having ghostly activity. Once you reach the haunted building, you take your Ghostbuster and drop a trap down somewhere, place your first Ghostbuster to one side of the screen, your second to the other, and then fire your proton beams, which you can use to guide the ghost towards the centre of your trap. You release your trap when you think the ghost is over it and hope that it catches it. If it doesn't, however, well, you get slimed and that ghost gets away, and what you do is you go back to the map and repeat the process. Another thing to be aware of is once the city's PK energy has reached a certain level, the Marshmallow Man will appear and stomp all over the city, causing massive damage, and well, you're out of pocket for it because you were supposed to stop it. And why is this important? Well, this game isn't actually so much about being an action Ghostbuster game, more of a Ghostbusters franchise simulator, because you see the whole point of the game is to catch as many ghosts as you can, stop the Marshmallow Man from damaging too much, and making enough money at the end of the game, well, to win that day and be allowed to be a Ghostbuster again. And I think this is where a lot of people didn't really enjoy the game. I think they were looking for a more action orientated game, whereas this, well, you were running your own Ghostbusters franchise. And anyone who knows the sorts of games that I have grown to love over the years will see exactly why running a Ghostbusters franchise was much more interesting to me than actually just being a Ghostbuster running about zapping ghosts. Now, it might not be everyone's cup of tea, but I certainly recommend anyone who gets the chance to play the ZX Spectrum's version of Ghostbusters. You know, back when Activision made games for gamers and not just to line their own pockets. And just as a special treat, at the very end of this video, if you want to stay that long, I'm going to play the intro to this game, because you see, it's a full-length karaoke version of the Ghostbusters theme song, played on an 8-bit microcomputer, and it's absolutely glorious. And I hope you do wait until the very end to experience that. So there you have it, my friends. The letter G and the A to ZX of the Spectrum. Now, there were some howlers, no doubt, but there were some classics in there as well, and I hope some of them have piqued your interest, and perhaps some of them had made you think, I want to fire that game into the sun and forget it for eternity. Whatever the case may be, drop it in the comments. I love comments and I love getting back to them. Let's get the debate going on the ZX Spectrum, because, well, that's not an archaic device. Anyway, thank you again for watching, and of course, if you've enjoyed this content, well, please give me a thumbs up, because one, it makes a difference to the channel, but you know what, more importantly, it makes a huge difference to me to know that some of you wonderful people out there do enjoy this strange little bit of content that I put out every now and again. And of course, subscribe if you want to see more. I will be doing a ZX Spectrum video at least once a week, and of course there's a lot of random stuff in between as well, which you might just be interested in, you never know. So, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, well, you could pop over to this guy here. This is Geordie Slasher Gaming. He's a fantastic creator who's just decided to come back to YouTube after a small break and put out some of the videos that he wants to make, which quite frankly, that's the only videos we should be making. So, until next time, watch some of him and cheerio!